Okay. Fine. So moving on pretty swiftly. Again, points which really for your guide, for your purposes, are just not hugely necessary. But over the years, the court's kind of obsession with trying to develop principles post-Salomon that enabled particularly unsecured creditors to bring claims against the beneficial owners of the company led to various confusion over what was actually meant, what was intended by all of this. The starting point fairly early on, and I couldn't pinpoint a case where it was first mentioned, the starting point being this idea of a veil, something that floats between the beneficial owners on the one hand and the separate legal personality of the company on the other. This veil that floats between them to protect the identity of the beneficial owners from the company as a separate legal person. And over the years, the terms piercing the veil, lifting the veil, were used interchangeably. 1991, the court in Atlas Maritime clarifies, as helpful as it was, piercing the veil is all about you see, treating rights or liabilities or activities of the company as being the same as those of the beneficial owners. So treating the beneficial owners and the company as being one and the same. That is piercing the corporate veil. Lifting the veil, on the other hand, the court suggested was intended to be used where it was simply necessary to look to who the beneficial owners were, simply to identify them for some legal, some lawful purpose. And I'm not going to go into it now, but there are examples in particularly property law in the UK where it's occasionally necessary to treat, in landlord and tenant relationships, for example, a beneficial owner who's an occupation of a property owned by his company, where you need to identify them and treat them as being one and the same, but it's not something I'm going to go into. So the court drew this distinction between piercing the veil is that which was intended to focus on, well, wrongdoing, the public policy necessity of being able to hold the beneficial owners of the company as being one and the same as the company. And effectively, when we're looking to liabilities and obligations, so as to impose those on the beneficial owners. Which is all very interesting, more practical for your purposes. We can talk through the common law principles that go to the piercing of the veil, and we can see, as we'll do shortly, how the attitude of the courts has changed over time in England and Wales. As I said, ultimately now the Supreme Court has been quite clear. This is basically a fiction. It isn't going to find circumstances in which it will pierce the veil. However, there are circumstances under legislation where an individual, be it a director, a beneficial owner, etc., can be held liable to contribute to some debts or liabilities incurred by a company, but in circumstances where they've committed some statutory wrongdoing, some statutory offence, as opposed to this piercing of the veil. They're not being treated under statute as one and the same as the company. And that's not the effect of here, section 433 in the Guernsey law and 434 on the next slide. They're being attributed with an entirely distinct liability of that of the company. It may be that the end result is one and the same. The company may be indebted to a third party as a consequence of some fraudulent or wrongful trading. The remedy may be to call upon a director or beneficial owner to compensate or pay damages or to settle the company's liability. But that's because that person has committed some offence under the law. They personally are liable under one of these legislative provisions. It's not because they and the company are being treated one and the same. It's not because the veil is being pierced. It's because they have committed some offence, some wrongdoing. And again, that's something that, who knows whether it's down to my lack of clarity and explanation or not, but something undergraduate students in particular tend to struggle with. This person, the director, the beneficial owner, has committed an offence. They have breached a legislative provision, and there is a consequence to that. They are not being treated as one and the same as the company.
Do you frame that as because it's a breach of legislation, or do you frame that as like a personal action?
How do you mean in terms of how it's pursued?
In terms of why it's not piercing the veil?
Because this is,
It's legislative.
yeah, because this is a distinct, defined legislative offence. This has got a test. We apply the test to the individual. We're interested in their knowledge or their act or their omissions or whatever. And there's a consequence to that if they're found in breach. It is personal to them. And it may not apply to any other director or any other beneficial owner within the company, because those individuals may not satisfy the conditions of the legislative test, and so would not be subject to the same imposition of liability. Piercing the veil, again, I'm saying this, I think, more with my academics hat on than anything. Piercing the veil was always intended to expose the beneficial owners, whoever they may be, and treat them as being one and the same as the company, without any real distinction as between those beneficial owners themselves. Now, it may have been, had the law developed in a different way, that you would have come to a situation where the knowledge of those beneficial owners was being tested, so as to hold some liable and some not. But the law never got to that stage, as far as the piercing the veil is concerned. Here then, under 433, you have basically the Guernsey equivalent of the UK offence of fraudulent trading. And in 434, you have the equivalent for wrongful trading. And the legislative provisions are pretty much the same, I think, across Guernsey, Jersey, and the UK. I didn't notice any particular differences. So, what's the best way of working through this? Well, I suppose the starting point is, when is 433 relevant? And you see there under subsection 1A and B, in the winding up of a company, or you see there further provision in respect for PCC. So it's a remedy available in the course of winding up. That is when 433 is relevant. It's not actual. Prior to that, the company might, or the PCC must be in, or the sale rather, must be in winding up. And what are we looking for here in the following paragraph? We're looking for the business of the company or the sale having been carried on with intent to defraud creditors. It's a fairly wide definition of who those creditors may be, of the company, of the sale, or of any other person. I was going to ask Fran what she thought the intention of that was, because I wasn't entirely sure. Or for any fraudulent purpose, thereby taking it beyond, as in the UK, as in Jersey, beyond the intent to defraud creditors, specifically any fraudulent purpose in general, whatever that may be. That will fall foul of section 433. So, actionable in winding up, we're looking for intent to defraud creditors or for any other fraudulent purpose. And on application to the court may make an order against any persons who were knowingly parties to the carrying of the business in whatever the fraudulent manner was. So any persons, this isn't limited to directors. This is any person knowingly party to the carrying on of the business. That could be any manager, any employee, any beneficial owner. It doesn't matter. Section 433 doesn't distinguish between them. Incredibly broad imposition of liability extends beyond the directors to any person who was knowingly party to the carrying on of the business in a fraudulent way or with intent to fraud. The order then is to hold that person liable to make such contribution to the company or sales assets as the court thinks proper. So remember, this is in the context of winding up. The remedy is that the guilty party, whoever they may be, makes some contribution to the company or sales assets. And obviously, dealt with on a case-by-case basis, simply to the level that the court thinks proper. The court, of course, won't make that order of its own persuasion. It needs to be on application. And you see it's application by liquidator, administrator, receiver, or creditor, or member. Any of those parties can apply in the course of winding up for an order against a person or persons under section 433. It's important then obviously to read subsections 1 and 2 together in order to fully frame the offence and the circumstances that will arise, how it's pursued, and ultimately the remedy that the court may grant. But notwithstanding the need to look to the two together to properly frame your explanation of what the offence is, application, when you break it down, is fairly straightforward. We're looking to winding up, we tick that off. We're looking for an intent to defraud or any fraudulent purpose, we tick that off. We're looking for an application being made by qualifying persons under section 2, tick that off. And then we're looking to impose liability on some person who's knowingly party, so a knowledge requirement. It isn't ought to have known. It is pretty clear. This is an actual knowledge requirement. That then balancing the fact that this could be the imposition of liability on a manager, on an employee. Someone who is knowingly party to the carrying on of business rather than someone who ought to have known. So you tick that off, and then you come through to saying, well, look, assuming that the conditions are satisfied, the court may order that the person or persons may make such contributions to the company's assets as they think proper. And for our purposes, I wouldn't expect you to extend beyond that because it is entirely within the discretion of the court. That's what the level of penalty, I suppose, is. In the facts of the problem question, there would be a pretty clear signpost to your need to consider section 433 because fraud is such a high threshold to meet. It would have to be so clearly set out. On the facts that some fraudulent purpose had been carried on or that there was some intent to defraud, etc. In fact, I would go so far as to say you would be looking for that wording, probably, so as to avoid leaving it to doubt as to which provision applies or is intended to apply. So section 433 for fraudulent trading would be a pretty obvious signpost. Section 434 for what I call wrongful trading. Do you use the same term? I call it wrongful trading. The provision here is no different to that in Jersey or the UK, but it isn't defined, I don't think, as wrongful trading as directly as it is in the UK. There may be a less obvious signpost here, you see, because we don't need to be so explicit as to be referring to fraud or intent to defraud, etc. Here, we're simply concerned with the financial position of the company at a particular point in time and the decisions made by the directors of the company as to how to proceed. So it may be it could be a little less obvious on the fact. And so it's section 434 that I'd say pay some attention to. It's not, of course, going to be assessed as a 25-mark question itself, obviously, but as a few marks bolted on to some other wider set of facts. Particularly, I would say, if you were looking at a question involving directors and directors' duties, it would be worthwhile paying attention to what information you're given about the state of the company's finances. That, if anything, is going to be your signpost to, right, I need to consider section 434 and the potential for any of the directors to be held liable under that or the kind of final point of the question being as broad as saying, well, advise Mr. X as to his potential liabilities. That would catch his potential liability for breach of duty as it would catch his potential liability for wrongful trading. But the facts going to the wrongful trading may be less obvious than those going to breach of duty. So something to bear in mind and to be aware of. Section 434 then, in itself, again, fairly straightforward. Here, we're looking for a winding up of the company. We're looking again for an application by liquidator, creditor, or member. And again, we're looking for an order by the court that the relevant person be held liable to make such contributions to the company's assets as the court deems proper. Now, it goes on a bit further in terms of particularly the point with regards to the contribution, and that's dealt with separately in the study guide. The purposes for today in the context of legal personality is simply to highlight the fact that there could be the imposition of liability under section 434. And the core test here, if you like, under subsection 2. 1, company has gone into insolvent liquidation, we need to tick that off. 2, at some point before the commencement of winding up, a person knew or ought to have known. So here we don't have an actual knowledge test. It's knew or ought to have known there was no reasonable prospect of the company avoiding going into insolvent liquidation. And yeah, distinction from 433, that person was a director of the company at the relevant time. The liability under 434 only imposed on directors. And here, not limited to actual knowledge, but ought to have known, ought to have concluded, no reasonable prospects of the company avoiding going into insolvent liquidation. As I said, the provision itself goes on further in terms of dealing with that knowledge requirement, the steps that the person might have taken to avoid the insolvency of the company, or to best manage through it. I'm not going to go through all of those. It's simply to highlight here the potential imposition of liability. And the relevance to legal personality, this isn't treating the director and the company as being one and the same. It's not piercing the veil. We're talking about them in their capacity as director. This is simply holding them liable to contribute to the assets of the company in the context of liquidation because they have committed this offence. They have breached these relevant provisions. The test for solvency would need to apply, which is the balance sheet test, isn't it, for wrongful trading. So under subsection 6, company goes into insolvent liquidation if its assets are insufficient for the payment of its debts, its liabilities. That's a balance sheet test for insolvency. And the point we'll come back to when we look at directors, but although the in terms of determining whether or not the company has gone into insolvent liquidation, it defines it as the balance sheet test. sorry, as opposed to the knowledge requirement, which is what you're referring to. Is that right? You can, by all means, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, section 6 is passive.
Yeah. As opposed to imposing liability for cash flow insolvency for the purposes of section 8. Which, so distinct from the knowledge requirement under B. What was I going to say? The only other point then here, C is defined as director, but that includes shadow directors. So again, a point to come on to when we look at directors themselves. That's under subsection 7. I think I've already answered the next question. The 4.3. What's the difference in scope of 4.3.3 and 4.3.4? 4.3.3 would see the imposition of liability on any person, and so could potentially impose a liability on the beneficial owner of a company, but only in circumstances where that person was knowingly party to the carrying on of the fraud or the intent to defraud. It's not for any other reason beyond that. The status of the person under 4.3.3 is actually irrelevant. It is simply the knowledge requirement, and so is not in any way some kind of exception, as I try to stress, to the principle of limited liability. And 4.3.4, the imposition of liabilities on directors only. So you could say, well, we're not even concerned with limited liability in the veil because we are purely talking about the imposition of liability on directors. However, the one point that you could follow through in the academic discussion of this is a beneficial owner of a company could be a shadow director for the purposes of the law. And so again, as I mentioned a couple of moments ago in subsection 7 of 4.3.4, there could be an imposition of liability for wrongful trading on a shadow director. But again, it's irrelevant that they're beneficial owner of a company. It has nothing to do with their status as beneficial owner. They satisfy the test in law that qualifying as a shadow director and as a consequence subject to the same liability for wrongful trading as any other director. And you may just flag there again, I suppose, it's section 1.3.2, which deals with the definition of shadow director, but we'll come on to look at that when we explore directors in a bit more detail. As for fraudulent trading, then I said you'd be looking for a fairly clear signpost that there has been some intent to defraud or the carrying on of some fraud. Liability under section 4.3.4 then may be a little less obvious. It may simply be some passing comment within the facts, a wider set of facts dealing with breach of duty that goes to establishing a potential liability for wrongful trading. And it's the kind of point that I may purposely look to make, well, not to disguise, but to make a little less obvious. And that discussion, that analysis may need you to tie in section 1.3.2, identifying whether or not somebody qualifies as a shadow director. If so, looking then to 4.3.4, subsection 7, a shadow director is treated as a director for the purposes of 4.3.4, or if it extends the shadow director under 4.3.4, and then looking to the actual test under 4.3.4 itself to assess the level of that person's knowledge, or what they ought to have known, and therefore whether or not there should be the imposition of any liability under 4.3.4. So those kind of give you some building blocks. That's kind of my way of working through the interrelationship between the various points. You should just be setting through a fairly logical structure to your analysis of any issue. There are numerous offences that can be committed under the 2008 law. As with all of the companies' laws across all the jurisdictions, there are various offences for all manner of different things. But not a single one of them concerns the piercing of the veil. It does not concern the treating of beneficial owner as being one and the same as the company. Those offences will generally attach only to directors for failing in some way to do something which is prescribed by the law, and there will be consequences to that. But it has no bearing on the principle of limited liability if that person is also then the beneficial owner of the company. They have two different hats. And again, you're au fait with that, but the struggles that I have with undergraduate students are very real.
I think I'm sympathetic with that. I remember being I mean, I still feel the same way. Like, whether you call it piercing the veil or, you know, subjectly putting a little height, you know, it's
circumvent.
Circumvent, yeah. So, like, it's thing.
Yeah.
It is
Once you
piercing.
explain it with real
In
people
practice,
and real companies, it
Yeah.
will make sense when you read it on paper. You're like,
Yeah, but we risk sliding into like an academic.
Which is what we should be doing.
But it's just conceptual.
It's absolutely,
So the veil is a concept.
yeah.
We say we don't pierce it, but we have a legislative workaround. That's also a concept.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But I sort of, it's not. I just think it's a conceptual exercise to say that you can't pierce the veil because as a practical matter you can. You just gotta have the tool.
It's very easy though for practitioners. I see this on the JRC quite often. It's quite easy for practitioners to be sloppy in the way in which they explain these principles. And actually, if you're looking at it purely from an objective I'm marking exam paper point of view, the knowledge which is presented and the way it's explained is often too sloppy.
Yeah.
And if you look at it from an academic and esoteric point of view, no, that's not actually right. Despite the fact I know you're a partner at wherever.
Yeah, that actually happened. When I had my training contract, I also wanted to say, what did you like? And I was like, I thought the whole piercing the corporate veil thing was really interesting to do that. I pierced the corporate veil twice. I was like, pretty sure he's. I was like, okay then. But like, I was like, I don't think that actually.
That was probably a test. Did you get the job?
Yeah.
That was probably a test. That was they were waiting for you to jump in and say, actually, no. No, you didn't. Leading the way in company law. Well done, you. Pat on the back. Okay. Much merriment. You see, this is what comes from company law, as opposed to talking about fiduciary law and stuff like that. It's interesting. Yeah. There's some merriment that comes with it, or maybe you just have enough and it's 7:30. Okay, so legislative intervention, put in a box, put it to one side. We've got defined tests which will expose a particular party to liability in certain circumstances. Judicial intervention. The attempts made by the courts over many, many, many years to delineate some principles pursuant to which you could clearly pierce the veil and hold the beneficial owners liable for the debts, obligations, etc. of the company. And this has gone in peaks and troughs. At times it's all looked very promising, and now it all looks very sad and unlikely. In the English jurisprudence, two cases which, if you read some of the textbooks, are lauded as being examples of the court piercing the veil. Guildford, Motorco and Horn, and Jones and Lippman. However, neither actually concern the piercing of the veil in reality, not in law. Guildford, Motorco and Horn. Here you've got Horn, who sells used cars, and as he was a former employee of Guildford Motorco, When he left, he was subject to geographical restrictive covenants. He agreed that he would not compete with Guildford Motor Co within a certain geographical radius. So not unusual. In order then to work around that, Horne basically carries on business for a limited company. Long story short. And he is, he's in breach of the covenant because he is stood on a forecourt within the relevant geographical radius selling used cars. Guildford Motor Co bring a claim against him for breach of the covenant. He says, well, it's not me, it's the company which is stood on the forecourt. I may be physically there, but it's the company which is selling cars. The question is then, could the court pierce the veil so as to look through the company to identify Horne and allow a claim for damages to succeed against him? Well, the claim does succeed. And as I said, this case is lauded then for many years in the textbooks. I think I remember this, I certainly remember Jones and Lippman from when I did my LLB, lauded as being examples of the court piercing the veil. But if you actually read the judgment, that's not what the court did. The court simply enforced the terms of the restrictive covenant. It was a contractual issue. The fact is, Horne was physically present on a forecourt selling used cars. And the terms of the covenant were such that, well, he was in breach of that by being physically present within the relevant geographical radius. All the court did in Guildford Motor Co was enforce his contractual bargain, if you like. And it was in Preston Petrodal, this 2013 decision of the Supreme Court, where they looked back to this. I think it was in Press. There were a couple at the same time. I think it was in Press. The court looked back to this and they say, that wasn't piercing the veil. It was simply enforcing a contractual obligation. It was never piercing the veil. It may have been that's how it was in part framed by the claimant, by Guildford Motor Co. But the remedy which was granted was for breach of contract. And there's no problem with that. It's entirely straightforward. Jones and Lippman treated in a similar way over many years, with the academics saying this is a great example of the court piercing the veil. Here, Jones agrees to buy land from Lippman. They enter into a contract of sale, but prior to completion, Lippman incorporates a company and transfers the land into the company. He's sole beneficial owner, I think, and says, I'm sorry, I can't sell it to you now. So Lippman retains the ownership of the land through his limited co. Jones then goes to court to seek an order for specific performance, to compel the transaction to go ahead, but also frames the claim as piercing the veil, looking through the company to identify Lippman as the beneficial owner. And the claim succeeds. However, the court wasn't piercing the veil. It didn't frame the granting of its relief, its remedy on that basis. It was simply enforcing the contractual bargain between two parties. And it made its order for specific performance on that basis. Did it go as far as this? No, I can't remember, sorry, entirely unprofessional. I think the remedy perhaps was damages. I'll double check. Oh, there's no specific performance. It compels the bargain between the parties because there was a contract and it orders performance based on that contract. So as in Horne, it's simply respecting the contractual position, the contractual obligations between two private parties. Yeah.
Well, you might get to with, I think it's, but, and it mentions it here in Jones, it's this facade.
Yeah. So that's the buzzword, isn't it? In all of this is the facade. Before we do, DHN and Tower Hamlets, you come on a bit further, and the courts are still trying to get to a point where you've got a clear delineated principle for piercing the veil. And in DHN, the court looked to a group of companies, and in quite specific circumstances, it recognized a group of companies as being a single economic entity. It was a group of companies, a parent with its subsidiaries in the usual way. And it looked at that and it said, you know what, this is a single economic entity. They're carrying on business, all the profits, etc., the losses, they're being shared within the group. It is in reality a single economic entity. But the criticism of that decision came very quickly. In Wolfson, the court, this was a Scottish decision, but the court said in very, very strongly worded terms that the decision in DHN was erroneous. And it was in Wolfson, it's time with what Lauren just said, that the court actually introduced this idea of the mere facade and said that DHN was wrong. You could not look to a group of companies and simply treat them as a single economic entity. They are distinct persons in law. The parent and the subsidiary is a distinct legal person from the parent in the same way that a company is a distinct legal person from its human beneficial owners. In Wolfson, the Scottish court said the only circumstances in which the veil could be pierced is where the company is the mere facade, but didn't take us any further in understanding what a mere facade is. And that then becomes a common theme for this, for the development of this principle. So, single economic entity in the context of group companies is put to bed pretty early on. Nobody likes that. And we come to Adams, and Lawrence is quite right. This is, for many, many years, the case on piercing the veil. And again, I remember doing my LB and it being about Adams and Cape Industries. Here you've got decades worth of litigation involving Cape and its various entities across the globe, the majority of which concerns asbestos mining and the claims brought by workers in Cape's asbestos mines for personal injury. I'm not going to go into the facts of Adams and Cape. I'll come on to one of the other Cape cases, maybe later, maybe tomorrow. But in Adams and Cape, the claim comes before the House of Lords. It's a claim arising from enforcement of a judgment. I'm not going to go into it. But the court has to consider in what circumstances can it pierce the veil. And the court gave very clear guidance. It said, well, there are 3 situations in which you can do this. The first is where the court is interpreting a statute or a document. The second is where the company is a mere facade. And the third is where the subsidiary is an agent of the company. Now, this is House of Lords, so this should be really well-reasoned, clear-cut law. But it's not, because I don't think anybody ever knew or has ever known what situation number 1 was supposed to mean, the interpretation of a statute or document. Nor do I believe has there ever been any practical application of that. And 3, where the subsidiary is an agent of a company, we're not going to dwell on the law of agency, which is a commercial issue, but that had been rejected in prior courts, prior to the 1990 decision in Cape, and rejected in subsequent courts. You simply don't have an agency relationship between company and human shareholder, or between subsidiary and parent. You just don't have the agency relationship. Those conditions aren't satisfied, because that would fly in the face of legal personality. So of those 3 situations in Cape, the only one which ever had any traction was number 2, the mere facade. But as in Wolfson, And despite the fact we're another decade on, the House of Lords doesn't really tell us what a mere facade is, or how we can identify there being a mere facade. So, early examples, Horne, Lippmann. The remedies that were granted were not based on the piercing of the veil. Even if that was pleaded, it was simply the enforcement of contractual obligations in the usual way. And those claims succeeded because they succeeded in contract, not in company law. DHN, the court introduces the idea of the single economic entity, looking to the financial structuring of corporate groups and saying, well, we should treat this as one and the same because the subsidiaries are kicking profits back up to the parent and the parent is loaning out money to the subsidiaries. But nobody liked that. Wolfson, the Scottish court, introduces the idea of the mere facade but doesn't tell us what the mere facade is or when it will be proven. The House of Lords then revisit that in Cape and again set out these three situations where the veil will be pierced, but actually the first and the third have no real practical application. And the second is simply the mere facade, but without any real further development of what that means in practical terms, in terms of creating a test that we can follow through to identify the existence of a mere facade. So things are left somewhat in limbo. And certainly through then the 1990s and early 2000s, everybody likes the idea of Cape. Everyone likes the idea of the mere facade. And you go through another kind of raft of cases. There's one in particular in 2008, Hashem and Shaif. It's a family law case where a judge in the High Court thought, this is a great opportunity to determine what a mere facade is. Now, it's not in the study guide. But in Hashem and Shaif, I don't think I put it in. In Hashem and Shaif, this judge in the High Court, this family judge, and it's a horrible judgment to read. He goes through 8 steps for identifying the mere facade, which in fact, you could. I mean, look, even I've done it. You can take his 8 steps and you can hash it back into 3 core points to establish the existence of this mere facade. And then in 2008, we were all kind of a little bit excited about that, but we're all a bit wary that it's a family law case, it's in the High Court, it's clear he was just having a go at creating something. But yeah, in 2009, 2010, I was definitely flogging it in undergraduate company law classes to say, look at this. 8 steps, work through them, but the magic key is actually there's only 3 points you're considering. Yeah, I did that, I'm guilty of that. And then we get to 2013. And for the first time, these issues come before the higher courts. And they're asked, they're not asked, they take it upon themselves. That's what the courts do, isn't it? They take it upon themselves to have another stab at reframing the piercing of the veil. And in VTB Capital, which primarily concerns an interim application, it's just so removed from determining a case like Solomon. It is predominantly focusing on an issue within an interim application on jurisdictional. Court comes back to Hashem and Shaif and says, yeah, we like this. This all looks quite sensible if you pick your 8 points and frame them into 3. But, the court says, all of that is subject to one caveat. And again, you wonder how much they think this through before they say it. The caveat is that the court has no power to render the controller of a company, the beneficial owner, the controller of a company, sorry, that's flippant of me, beneficial owner, the majority controller of the company, that is the focus, controller, someone with control. The court has no power to render a controller of a company liable on some contract which the company has entered into, but which the controller is not a party to. So Hisham Shahid, of course, sets out these various principles. This is how you can pierce the veil. One of those factors was looking to control. And so hence in BTB, the court are focusing on this idea of the controller. And they say, yeah, this is nice, we like this, but subject to that one caveat. The court has no power to hold the controller of a company liable on a contract to which the controller of the company is not a party. So you then come to the slightly cyclical scenario where you're thinking, right, where does that actually take us? Because it's a bit like a snake eating itself. I didn't think that one through. It's coming full circle. So right. So does that mean we can't pierce the veil or what? Who cares? Point being, we come to Prest. And here, the Supreme Court, again, in the context of what is primarily family matters, nevertheless, it is the Supreme Court. Here, the Supreme Court say that there is not a single instance in this jurisdiction where the doctrine of piercing the veil has been invoked properly and successfully. And beyond that, it is actually an interesting judgment to read, because they do, again, come back to this idea of the controller and the focus on the controller and the circumstances in which the veil should be pierced. Controller of a company. But they're so scathing of the principle as a whole. One of them says it's a mere fiction. And it was impressive. It was in that context that they look back to Jones and Lippmann and Horn as examples of cases where the piercing of the veil wasn't invoked. It wasn't done so successfully because the remedies which were granted were purely in contract. And at the same time, wait for a bus and three come along at once. At the same time, in the Court of Appeal, you've got Antonio Gramsci, where the Court of Appeal, the judges in the Court of Appeal say, again, and I think fairly bold terms, bearing in mind it is only the Court of Appeal, but the piercing of the veil, and I can never say this properly, is an anomaly incapable of further development. And 6 years on, there has been no further development. There's been barely any discussion, I think, at the point, other than academic commentators saying, is that it? 100 years worth of jurisprudence trying to develop these principles basically shut down over the course of 3 judgments that all came in the same year, where not one of the courts was actually in any way positive about the concept of the piercing of the veil. They haven't shut it down entirely, despite the wording in Antonio Gramsci. Prest has, to a degree, left the door open, but having followed this over the years, and as I said, the highs and the lows, I don't think we could get any lower than we currently are. I think it would be very difficult for a subsequent court to get beyond what the court has said in Prest. And that pretty much is where we end with judicial intervention as far as the piercing of the veil is concerned. However, that's not to say, again, that there aren't other circumstances under common law where I prefer circumventing to what Lauren Frederick has surgical piercing of the veil. There are circumstances under the common law where the veil can nevertheless be circumvented. However, again, as with legislative intervention, you're still looking for, defense is the wrong word, you're looking for liability to be imposed on some person in fairly limited circumstances in tort. Now, there are quite established cautious principles pursuant to which you're effectively circumventing the veil in English law. But here, again, you've got to be careful because we're not treating beneficial owners as being one and the same as the company. Rather, we are simply saying that in certain circumstances, the courts will impose a tortious liability on a person, a beneficial owner, in limited circumstances, but that's subject to satisfying the relevant tortious principles. The outcome may be pretty similar to what you would expect if you said, we are piercing the veil, and the court allowed you to do so. The three cases there, and there's another one, Palmer, Birch and Lloyd, which I mentioned earlier, they deal very, certainly Williams and Chandler deal with very different scenarios. Williams is all about negligent misstatement and is very much cast within the realms of misrepresentation and misstatements and looks to the potential liabilities, in that case, of a director and majority shareholder of Natural Foods. Here, the director majority shareholder produces a brochure which is used to sell franchises of this health food company. The director majority shareholder takes responsibility, is expected for producing this glossy prospectus, this brochure. However, it's the employee of the company, a manager, who then goes out into the field to build relationships with prospective buyers of these franchises and ultimately sells them. Now, in the course of doing his job, the employee, the manager, goes out, he takes his glossy brochure, his prospectus, and he uses the information in that to sell these franchises. Now, I had one of these cases, and we settled it very quickly because I think it's probably fairly rife in the industry. All of the information, the financials, the profits, what you can hope to make in the next 5-10 years, all complete rubbish. It's all completely made up. Certainly that was the case I was dealing with. And that was no different in Natural Life Health Foods. All of the financial information on which these franchises were being sold was grossly inflated. Long story short, someone purchases a franchise, they lose a lot of money, and they seek to bring claim for damages. The issue before the court was whether or not director majority shareholder could be held liable, because ultimately it was on the basis of his information that the franchise was sold and the purchaser was led to enter into the purchase of the franchise. The claim failed on the facts. However, the court recognised that in those circumstances, it would be possible to impose liability on our direct majority shareholder if he had taken some personal responsibility for the prospective purchaser. If he'd put his arm around them and said, this is what you're going to make over the next 5 years. But more than that, and this is really the limitation of the principle, more than that, he would have to develop some special relationship with them. And that's obviously not defined as to what it should be or what it should look like or its extent. In taking personal responsibility, that director, that shareholder, must create some kind of special relationship. This needs to be more than one conversation about prospective financials. It needs to extend beyond that. And on the facts in Williams, that wasn't proven. His director shareholder had never been asked to shake hands with this couple who bought the franchise. It was all done through one of his employees. The case I had, director shareholder was the business, and the business was him, and he was out in the field shaking hands and telling people very naughty things, which he didn't tell me when he instructed me. but it became quite apparent that everything he said was untrue. And on that, he would have been imposed, he would realistically been exposed to the tortious liability.
They use like a framework. They use a framework of like misrepresentation to kind of cover that.
Negligent misstatement.
Yeah. So they weren't kind of just saying, you know, it's a pierce. They weren't saying it's a pierce the veil.
No.
They were just saying.
This is the imposition of tortious liability. No difference in duty of care, breach of the duty, loss
So
suffered.
they just failed. The claim just failed.
Claim failed because he didn't have that relationship didn't exist. And the company was insolvent. So bear in mind, you would have two potential defendants. You'd have the company itself, and then they tried to bring this claim against beneficial owner. Company is insolvent. So he is the only attractive defendant. Briefly then, Chandler and Cape deals with Cape litigation. So again, this is 2012. We're 20 years on from the 1990s House of Lords, but it is still ongoing. There are, I don't even know how many claimants affected by the asbestos mining practices of Cape, all of whom have suffered, I'm sure, very terrible personal injuries. The point in Chandler and Cape is that you've got what is now Cape PLC, you've got the parent based in the UK. You've then got its subsidiaries in South Africa who own and operate the various mines. The issue then being why so many of the claims failed over the years and so on and so forth. But subsidiaries are nothing. They've got no assets, they're insolvent, they're worthless, whatever. They're not attractive parties against which we're playing. And so someone in a class action in Chandler, some benevolent lawyer has a go on no win, no fee and looks to hold the parent liable in court based on, I think at the time, pretty interesting criteria. It looks to the knowledge of the parent for what the subsidiary's been up to. Now, you've got to, I suppose, to a degree, treat the decision in Cape with caution because it is fact specific, but the claim succeeded, long story short. One of the first instances where Cape litigation was actually successful, so the claim was successful. It was possible to impose a tortious liability on the parent company for the acts, for the omissions of the subsidiary. So again, establishing a duty of care, a breach of the duty and loss suffered, those core tortious principles. Parent company was held liable in tort for the acts and omissions of its subsidiaries in circumstances where, and this is why it's so fact specific, Cape as the parent was found to have knowledge of the risks to which the subsidiary's employees were exposed. So it had knowledge of the risks to which the employees of the subsidiary were exposed. It had the technical know-how to limit, to mitigate those risks. So that was proven on the facts. It had that technical know-how, that knowledge as to how to mitigate, to minimize the risks to which the employees of the subsidiary were being exposed. As such, the court said, parent owed a duty to the employees of the subsidiaries to take care. It imposed that tortious duty of care because of the knowledge of the parent. The parent didn't do anything, it didn't seek to intervene in what was happening in the subsidiary's operations. It did nothing. That was the breach of the duty of care, and the losses that were suffered were the various personal injuries. It was the knowledge
So
of.
how do you look at the knowledge element of a legal person or the counsel?
Well, in Cape, you see, this is why it's so fact specific, because parent company isn't a holding company. And that's the point in Thompson. It wasn't a holding company, it's not a shell, It is an active trading company with its own interests in mining. It has in-house geologists, it has in-house health and safety consultants in the parent. That is what is so fact-specific about CAPE. Now, to drill down in one way on the point you make, that's just getting too academic, too esoteric, talking about the controlling mind of a parent company. That's not what the court was looking at. The court was simply looking at the fact that this wasn't a shell, this wasn't a holding company, as most parents are. It was actively trading. It had its own operations. It had its own in-house geologists, health and safety, so on and so forth. Necessarily then, within the company, however, and the court didn't get into that issue of the controlling mind. However you look at it, it had the in-house knowledge. But what was happening in the South African mines was wrong. It had the knowledge of the risks, and it had the knowledge of how to mitigate those risks. But it did nothing to cascade that knowledge down into the subsidiary. It didn't do anything to intervene. In Thompson, the court said it's necessary to treat CAPE with that degree of caution because typically a parent company is just a holding company. And if it is just a holding company, it won't be possible to evidence the level of expertise that existed in-house in CAPE. And so to an extent, the application of that principle in CAPE will be pretty limited because certainly in the UK, the majority of parents are just holding companies. And so yes, they'll have assets, but they won't have any active trading knowledge, or business knowledge, so to speak. That was where CAPE slipped up. Within the parent, they were actively trading in the same areas, the same sectors as their subsidiaries were. So it's probably a cautious lesson for any similar sized organization to actually strip back what they're doing in their parent.
How far? Because is the problem that they didn't have health and safety people?
Basically,
they have health and safety people like a subsidiary.
Subsidiary is basically saying, there's our mine, in you go. We aren't taking precautions for your health and safety, or they don't say that, but they don't take precautions for health and safety. That knowledge existed within the parent, and the parent didn't send out a team to the mine to say, right, you've got to do this and you've got to do that. Bear in mind, although this litigation is 2012, or the judgment, sorry, is 2012, the actual mining practices that are being complained of are going back much longer. And so, again, the application of the principle on those facts will probably be more limited today because people are much wiser, much more cautious about those kind of issues.
I'm just trying to think of what the structural fix would be for is it just diffuse your experts, not
Not at top,
not a top,
not at top,
basically.
no,
It's put them at the bottom as a consultant.
essentially, yeah.
Although then I suppose you could still.
What I wondered, thinking it through, what I wondered in the past was, what if you then started to look laterally across other subsidiaries? Here we're simply talking Topco, you're right, we're talking about the parent. What if we're looking at expertise elsewhere? Do the linkages start to become too set apart to draw the same conclusions you did in Chandler? I don't know. But another example of how the common law principles can look to circumvent, to impose that liability on the parent company. We're not piercing the veil, we're not treating them as being one and the same thing in law, we're simply saying, you, as a legal person, owed a duty to this claimant, and you breached that duty, and you're liable for loss in the usual way. So it's something we're saying you've got to be cautious now. I'm sorry, but the only final point in the case I mentioned earlier is Palmer, Birch and Lloyd, where the court imposed, they explored the concept of the economic tort. So Palmer, Birch and Lloyd, last year, 2018, the court, this is High Court, the court explores the idea of the economic tort, which is a very broad term for them to have used, but it's they're used in circumstances where, as I mentioned earlier, you have litigation involving an insolvent company that never has any prospect of actually settling judgment. Yet its litigation costs are funded by someone, in that case a director, sorry, not a director, in that case the chap who was in theory ultimate beneficial owner and effectively director, he was a shadow director, he was acting through nominees, but in position of liability on that party who's funding litigation simply for the fact that it's running up costs to the other side. And this happens all the time. I don't know, maybe like I said, it's just South Wales and the West, but this is all the time. I had it most recently, February, after 3 months worth of litigation that just took up all my time between the same two parties, ultimately beneficially across various structures. And I kept saying to my client over and over again, look, you've got to be aware that if we go too far with this, you're going to be on the hook potentially for these costs. Yeah, like I said, when I had Barry, the guy who was selling his franchises, when I took Barry on, he didn't tell me any of this. He came through subsequently, as is often the case. But yeah, where do you get these figures from, Barry? Just made them up, basically.
So, you could frame that almost as fraudulent trading, couldn't
you? It was certainly falling within wrongful trading, whether or not because they're allowing the company to continue to exist, knowing that it doesn't quite fit within the test, but knowing that if a judgment is made against it, they'll be able to satisfy it. So you could possibly slip it in there. Fraudulent trading, I'm not sure, because again, you're looking for such a high threshold of intent to defraud. And on one hand, I want to say, yeah, I follow your thought process. But the other point to me is, well, do you know what? In English, we just don't really see the use of the fraudulent trading provision because it's such a high threshold to meet. It's not a criminal standard, but it's still a very high threshold. And we'd say, look, this chap, if you're not doing it to defraud anyone, you're just doing it because you really hate these people. And you're doing it for the sheer buggeration factor of making them run up legal fees.
they just do that? I haven't seen that.
So my client, Kashif, is running up huge amounts of litigation costs. We've got, at one point we had, this nearly blew me over the edge, we had 7 adjudications and we had 3 arbitrations and 2 sets of proceedings in the High Court running at the same time. And I'm really happy because the fees are just coming like this. And the costs that the other side are running up are astronomical. So Kashif's taking that. That's his pressure point, get them to spend money. The other side, they appoint this chap from, we say this, Wales Valleys, carries a certain connotation. He starts throwing battery acid on cars. She's got a McLaren F1 covered in battery acid, the damage, 30,000 pounds worth. Even his father, who's this lovely old chap, Asian guy in his 80s, he's fantastic. See him in the sauna at the gym. His old battered Land Rover, battery acid all over it. So they play that game. We're playing the costs game. And we get to I get to a point where I'm putting my blind up in the morning, looking at my car, thinking, is it going to be me next? Luckily the lawyers were they were putting squatters in buildings. This one's for 3 months. Then I got the property team going, squatters out. And ultimately, ultimately, we got to a point where I was just, right, what, you know, you're getting married in 4 weeks, what do you want to do here? Do you really want this to go on? And ultimately, it was that which swung it at the end of the day. Other side are on the verge of, pretty much on the verge of bankruptcy now, because they've paid out so much for lawyers, but we settled it. We didn't quite go as far as decimating them, because my point to him was, look, if you do that, the other things that they're doing are only going to get worse. It's an interesting market that I work in. That was a bit unusual. And it also meant that I think I hit